Vance Joseph is going to be a hot commodity for NFL teams this upcoming year because of the fact that he has done such a good job with this Broncos defense over the past 3 seasons. But today I want to take a look at the entire football life of Vance Joseph, from his early days at CU in 2001 as a young graduate assistant, all the way through his years with the 49ers, Texans, Bengals, Dolphins, his first run in Denver, the criticism he faced, redeeming himself in Arizona, and finally his return to the Broncos, where he's become one of the franchise legends, if I'm being honest. And yes, we're talking about the shortcomings, but we are also talking about the growth, the players who swear by him, and why so many people in Broncos country now genuinely believe he deserves another shot as an NFL head coach. He has quickly cemented himself as a legend here, and while it remains to be seen how we finish the season, he is going to be a hot commodity this offseason for teams that have head coach openings. Vance Joseph's story is uniquely woven into the fabric of an amazing sports state that we have here in Colorado. Before he ever coached it down, he was playing for CU back in the early 1990s, first as a quarterback, then as a DB. That alone gave him a rare dual perspective understanding of the game. He knew how offenses thought, and he knew how defenses reacted, playing both quarterback and DB. In 1999, after pursuing professional playing opportunities with a handful of practice squads and even a stint in NFL Europe, he came back to Boulder as a graduate assistant. By 2001, he was fully embedded on the staff. This was the era when CU was still nationally competitive, and while these early college years didn't make headlines, they built his foundation as a communicator, a technician, and a teacher of the game, and a leader of men. In 2005, he entered the NFL with the San Francisco 49ers as an assistant DB coach. The team was in a rebuild, not the powerhouse of the 80s or 90s, and Vance Joseph quickly learned the realities of professional coaching. Under Mike Nolan and later Mike Singletary, he experienced multiple schemes, a bunch of roster turnover, and the challenge of coaching veterans. And by 2006, he was promoted to defensive backs coach, a significant jump for a young assistant. But Joseph learned how to adjust to the speed of the league, how to package complex information in simple language, and how to maintain professionalism and stability even during losing seasons. He didn't have the luxury of winning records in San Francisco, but his reputation grew. He was smart, he was composed, and players started to listen to him. In 2011, after Harbaugh was hired and turned over the staff in San Francisco, he joined the Houston Texans as their DB coach under Wade Phillips, one of the greatest defensive minds in NFL history. This period accelerated Vance Joseph's growth dramatically. Wade Phillips' system demands versatility, communication, and discipline in the secondary. Vance Joseph worked with players like Jonathan Joseph, Kareem Jackson, and Glover Quinn, all of whom consistently praised his clarity and detail-oriented coaching. Houston had some pretty strong defensive years while Vance Joseph was their DB coach in 2011 and 2012, and Vance Joseph learned how to coach in a winning environment. And winning teaches a coach about urgency, about weekly structure, and about adjusting once opponents begin game planning directly to counter your strengths. By the time he left Houston after 2013, Joseph had become one of the most respected position coaches in the NFL. In 2014 and 2015, Joseph coached the defensive backs in Cincinnati under Marvin Lewis. These Bengals teams were very physical, they were opportunistic, and filled with strong personalities. Vance Joseph coached Adam Pac-Man Jones, Reggie Nelson, and others, and this stop proved that Vance Joseph could manage emotional, competitive, high-energy players without friction. He built trust and stability inside the secondary, and Cincinnati's defense was among the more productive AFC units during this period, especially in takeaways. By the end of the 2015 season, in which the Bengals were a really, really strong team, but the wheels started to fall off when Andy Dalton went down, Vance Joseph had firmly established himself as a legitimate defensive coordinator candidate. Every stop along the way proved the same thing. Players liked playing for him, and he communicated at a level that they respected. In 2016, Vance Joseph finally got his shot at running his own defense when Miami hired him as a defensive coordinator. This was his first chance to build a complete defensive identity. They had injuries, they had depth issues, and inconsistent pieces, but Joseph's unit played very fast and aggressive. They were physical up front, they strained on third down, and they maximized what they had on the roster. It wasn't a dominant defense, but people inside the league paid attention to how Vance Joseph led that group and how much buy-in he got from players, especially respected veterans throughout the year. Miami's defensive culture that year reflected Vance Joseph's steady and positive approach. Then came the biggest moment of his career. The Broncos hired Vance Joseph as their head coach in 2017, 11 calendar months after winning Super Bowl 50. He was charismatic, he was poised, and he interviewed extremely well. Denver saw a leader who could stabilize the team caught between the championship era of 2015 and an unclear offensive future. And it seemed like the team had tunnel vision on Joseph, considering they could have had Kyle Shanahan. But like many first-time head coaches, Joseph walked into a very, very difficult situation. I think much more than any of us were willing to admit at the time. Denver's quarterback position was unstable. It was either 2015 7th rounder Trevor Siemian or one of the most mentally, technically, fundamentally unsound football players I think we've ever seen here in Broncos country, Paxton Lynch, or Brock Osweiler, who had gotten cut from Houston. The roster had aging veterans who were at odds with young players. The team lacked offensive identity because of how bad they were at drafting skill position players, and the offensive line was an absolute joke during these seasons. Years and years of poor drafting decisions masked by an elite offense in 2013 and defense in 2015 caught up to Denver's roster in 2017. Vance Joseph was a defensive coach trying to manage both sides of the ball, and he wasn't even allowed to put his own staff together, so it's no wonder the offense consistently struggled. The Broncos went 5-11 in 2017 and 6-10 in 2018, and I want to talk about his first stint here as a head coach because Vance Joseph faced criticism. Sometimes fair, often very excessive, but this is Broncos country, okay? Fans expect big things, and the organization wants results. The thing that told me he ultimately wasn't ready for the big chair was whenever we lost in 2017, his first year as a head coach, we lost badly, and we were humiliated. We got our doors blown off in several games. He'd always say, we had an awesome week of practice, then we'd get pummeled, and everyone was wondering what actually went on during that week of practice. In 2018, the team did a little bit better with big contributions from rookies like Philip Lindsay, Bradley Chubb, and Cortland Sutton. And they played some very competitive teams really hard that year. They got 2 enormous wins over the 12-4 Chargers on the road and completely sent the Steelers, who were their own soap opera in Antonio Brown's final year there, into freefall mode. Then we proceeded to lose 3 completely winnable games against non-playoff teams that we should have won. No excuses, but even in the hardest moments, Joseph never lost the locker room. Like, players spoke very highly of him. They said he told the truth, he never panicked, and he treated them like adults. In later interviews, especially the one with Peter Schrager we saw this past week, Vance Joseph admitted that if he could redo his head coaching tenure, he would be more assertive in personnel conversations instead of just a happy to be there, happy to have this job sort of thing. More direct in shaping the roster, wanting to build the offensive line, and being less deferential during the internal debates. And that level of honesty and self-reflection is rare in NFL head coaches. Joseph wasn't ready in 2017, and while the organization didn't put him in a great position to succeed, the fact that he's honestly admitted it is crazy, and sometimes that's what growth truly looks like. After Denver let him go, Joseph went to Arizona as a defensive coordinator under Cliff Kingsbury, and I think this is where the narrative around him started to change throughout the 4 seasons he was a defensive coordinator. Now, what really impressed me about Vance Joseph was how he carried himself on the in-season Hard Knocks. Vance Joseph and Kingsbury got a lot of screen time, and one of them commanded their unit. The other was in complete freefall mode and on track to be fired and shipped off to Thailand. Kyler Murray, especially early on in his career, had his moments, but he also had a trend of starting fast and completely collapsing in the second half of the year. Games for Arizona during this time period were often very chaotic. And yeah, it made for exciting football, but drives were very quick. And then in 2022, Vance Joseph's defense spent a lot of time on the field, but performed very well considering the circumstances. He's not blameless for the failures of Arizona during that time period, considering the Cardinals completely wasted 2 first-round picks on versatile linebackers. And Vance Joseph does deserve some blame for failing to coach Isaiah Simmons and Zaven Collins to just not being worth their draft slots and being completely wasted picks. But despite all that, Joseph stabilized Arizona. His defenses were aggressive, they were well-coached, they were fundamentally sound, and he got the most out of players that many teams had overlooked. He held the Cardinals together during very turbulent seasons. And while the offense stalled or imploded at times, Vance Joseph was often the unit that kept Arizona competitive. League insiders took notice, and Vance Joseph was no longer defined by his failure in Denver. He was respected again as a teacher, builder, and a steadying force by the time it was time for some new blood down there in Arizona. Sean Payton brought Vance Joseph back to Denver, this time as a defensive coordinator. It was a very, very unique reunion, and honestly, I didn't think a lot of the fan base was going to be on board with this when it was happening, but considering the other candidates that were leaked were Rex Ryan and Matt Patricia, I was all for hiring Vance Joseph when I see what the other candidates were. But Vance Joseph, he walked into the building with humility and experience, not ego. Fans were not happy about this, and let's be honest, I was one of them. I thought Vance Joseph was the Nathaniel Hackett of defense, and his early 2023 defense struggled, and they struggled badly. And the low point after getting absolutely dunked on by the Sam Howell Commanders 1 week before was the historic loss to Miami, in which we gave up 70 points. Many coaches would have unraveled under that pressure, and there were calls from very prominent people in Broncos country to fire Vance Joseph after 3 games, and I don't think anybody would have blamed Sean Payton for that after that disaster, but they remained steady internally. The Broncos made in-season depth chart changes, out with Isang Bassi, out with Damari Mathis, out with Randy Gregory, out with Frank Clark, in with Jaquan McMillan, Fabian Moreau, Nik Bonitto, and Jonathan Cooper. So they were able to adjust personnel groupings. They simplified certain responsibilities, and the unit began climbing out of the hole and went on an insane run of turnovers that year, even if they actually weren't playing great defense. But as the season went on, young players developed, they settled in, and the defense was playing faster, they communicated better, and they found their identity. That growth carried into 2024 and into 2025, where Vance Joseph's influence over the roster, the developmental pipeline, and the defensive identity of the team has become impossible to ignore. We still are a defensive team despite having an offensive head coach and despite spending the 12th overall pick on a quarterback in the 2024 draft. But one thing that really impressed me with Joseph is his ability to help elevate role players into key contributors and contributors into dependable starters and those starters into stars. And it's a big reason why many inside the organization believe that he deserves another head coaching opportunity. And with Denver being down 3 first-round picks and 3 second-round picks because of the fact that they traded for Russell Wilson and because of the fact that they traded for Sean Payton, you needed your in-house guys to step up. You needed your cheap free agent signings to step up. And boy, did they ever. Jonathan Cooper, Zach Allen, Nik Bonitto, Brandon Jones, even Patrick Surtain were examples of guys who completely raised their game leaps and bounds, even beyond their potential that I had never even thought of throughout this entire time that Vance Joseph was the defensive coordinator. And in 2024, the team still had a couple of enormous liabilities on the starting roster due to limited capital and cap space. But in 2025, they built a defense that arguably has 0 holes besides discrimination towards a cornerback that gets flagged for pale interference. And that's why Vance Joseph has become an unlikely but authentic legend in Broncos country. Not because he won a Super Bowl, not because he had a flawless coaching career, because he represents resilience, he represents humility, he represents growth, and he left Denver once with criticism ringing in his ears, and he returned with the fan base being pretty mad at the hire, but he came back with no resentment and only determination. He helped rebuild this defense, he helped rebuild players, and he rebuilt his own reputation in the process, and that's what Broncos country has embraced. A man who grew, a man who adapted, and a man who never stopped believing in the work. And honestly, Vance Joseph, you are a franchise legend. So that's the full story, from Colorado player to assistant to head coach to a redeemed leader back in Denver again. And if the trend continues, the question isn't whether Vance Joseph will get another head coaching job. The question is when and which team will be smart enough to give him that opportunity. I selfishly hope he takes the Ben Johnson route and he is not ready to leave until the perfect job opens up to where it's a good situation, where it's a good organization, where you're not going to get the short end of the stick even if things go bad. But overall, there are a few teams that I think would be very, very smart to acquire the services of Vance Joseph, and that's the story of how VJ redeemed himself here in Broncos country.